Okay, we are live. Welcome to Wednesday night Bible study. I want to emphasize, come to men's prayer breakfast Saturday at 8 o'clock, guys. We haven't had one in a while. We're kind of getting that reestablished, so show up at 8 o'clock. If you know somebody needs to come with you, bring them. Okay, so we are in 2 Samuel 2. It's been 4 weeks since I taught. 2 weeks ago, we were all huddled around the fireplace trying to stay warm. It was about 8 degrees outside. So we always like to start with a little bit of a review so they'll kind of segue into tonight's lesson. And always good to have visitors, and so it's nice for them to understand where we are. Anybody need a lesson sheet? Raise your hand if you didn't get one. Ricky's got some back there. Help you follow along. Okay, so we're going to start off with review. We just finished 1 Samuel. At the end of 1 Samuel, King Saul, who had been the king of Israel for, we think, 40, 45 years or so, and 3 of his sons were killed in battle with the Philistines. And so the Philistines then occupied a fairly large section of northern Israel at that time. Then we started 2 Samuel chapter 1, the last lesson we taught 4 weeks ago. And at that lesson, a man had come a 3 days journey from the battlefield where the Philistines beat Israelites down into South Judah, where David and his 600 men and their families were staying at the town of Ziklag. And it was, remember, he had been kind of under the protection of the Philistine king Achish. And so this man comes and he's in mourning. And we know that because he's got dirt on his head and he's wearing torn clothes. And that was a sign that you were in mourning. So David asked him what happened because, obviously there's no news back then. There's no way to find out what happened miles and miles away. And so David had known about the battle because initially he had gone up there with King Achish to fight against the Israelites, but the other 4 Philistine kings said, David's not fighting on our side. We don't trust him. They sent him back home to the 3 days journey south. And so David asked this man, who are you and why are you mourning? And he said, well, I'm a foreigner. I'm an Amalekite, actually, who grew up in Israel. His father was apparently an immigrant. He said, so he has grown up his entire time in Israel. He said, I was at the battlefield. And I was watching it. And what we learn is that he had fabricated the story to try to make himself look good. So he had 3 days of walking toward David's camp to figure out what kind of story would impress David, that David would think he was a hero. So what his version was of Saul's death was that he was watching the battle. As we know, back then there were people that did that. They would just, they didn't have TV to watch violence on, so they'd go to battles. And so he said, Saul was mortally wounded, and I was nearby, and Saul asked me to kill him and run his sword through him because he knew if the Philistines captured him, they would torture him, which is true. Now David doesn't really know what really happened, but David immediately asked the man, he said, why would you kill your own king? Because you've been living under the authority of Israel all your life as an immigrant, but still you're bound to the laws of Israel. Why would you kill your own king? And that's not exactly the answer that the man thought David would give him, but David had him executed because he said he had killed his own king. Now, what's interesting is that David, knowing that Samuel had anointed him to be the next king, and this was probably 15 years earlier, and David had run from Saul for his life. For 12 to 13 years, Saul had been trying to kill David because he knew David was anointed to be the next king, and Saul wanted Jonathan, his oldest son, to be the next king. But he still respected the office of the king in spite of all those years of running for his life. So two quick points I wanted to bring up that I kind of failed to mention at the last lesson. I guess you can call these bonus lessons. Number one is that God's children should think differently than the world thinks. last Sunday morning in Jason Hicks' Bible class, if you don't have a Sunday morning Bible class, I recommend that. It's over in the youth building. We were going through Romans, and we were talking about the idea of sanctification. And as God's children, we are to be sanctified. And that word is a big word we don't use much anymore, but it simply means to be set apart for a higher purpose. And so when we are set apart, we live in this world. We're in this world, but not of this world. And so we should have a thought process that's different than what the world has. So we saw that in that lesson last time, because the Amalekite man, he had 3 days to try to figure out how David would respond to this story he dreamed up about killing Saul, thinking that David would think he was a hero for killing Saul before the Philistines could get to him. But instead, David said, "You killed your own king, I'm going to kill you." So he did. So the man, in spite of 3 days of trying to think how David would respond, he didn't come close to David's thought process, because David was a man of God who thought differently than this man of the world thought. So, the Amalekite worldly thinking is, what's in this for me? How can I get some praise? How can I be looked upon as a hero? And that's how the world thinks. So the world thinks, what's in this world for me? What can I do that gets it for me? Whereas David, his thought process was guided by, what does God want in this situation? And that's more important than what I want in the situation. And so that's an example for us that as Christians, as sanctified people who have a set apart purpose that is higher than the world, is our thought process should be guided by, what does God want in each and every situation? Anyway, so and it works both ways. Just like the Amalekite man thought that David would think like he did, we should be careful to not think that the world thinks like we do. And Jesus addressed this in Matthew 10. He sent out the 12 apostles, and he told them, "Be harmless as doves, but be wise as serpents." In other words, be aware not everybody thinks like you do. And so in our witness, in our life, in our living amongst those of the world who are non-believers, we need to realize they don't think like we do. So it works both ways. Second lesson is that I was so impressed, if you think about that, how God's children should show respect to those in authority. I just think David's example to us is really remarkable, that we spent half of the book of 1 Samuel studying how Saul was trying to kill David, all the different situations where he was trying to kill David. And in spite of that, David never, ever showed disrespect to Saul because he was his king. God had put Saul in the place of authority, and David was going to show respect to that man even if he was trying to kill him for 12 or 13 years. And so I think that's a great example for us, that it is so easy for us to fall in, again, to how the world thinks about showing disrespect to people in authority. And we should be sanctified. We should be thinking at a different level. Because what can happen is, if we get all caught up in disrespecting worldly authority, we can lose our Christian witness. Because if you have somebody that disagrees with you on different worldly authorities, and that's your primary goal, is to convince them that you're right and they're wrong, they're not going to respect you as far as a Christian witness. We need to live above that level. We need to live above that level. Politics is going to be different in 10 years and 20 years. Jesus is going to be the same. Our calling is to be Christians, above all. We should never lose our witness over our opinion about worldly leaders, whether they be politicians, whether they be bosses, whether they be teachers. They all come and go. But Jesus doesn't. And our witness should not change. And it really grieves me when I see things on social media, brothers and sisters who are losing their Christian witness because they want to spout off about this or that. That really doesn't matter in eternity. My dad always told me, he said, you put the 100-year, if you want to find out what really matters, think about what's going to be worth something in 100 years. And really the only thing that's worth something in 100 years is Jesus. All this stuff of this world is going to come and go. So don't get so wrapped up in it that you lose your Christian witness. Okay, that's the 2 lessons from last time. Now we'll start tonight's lesson. All the verses are on your lesson sheet. We're using the English Standard Version, which is my favorite version. So we'll start chapter 2, verse 1 through 4. After this, meaning after David learned about Saul dying, which is what happened in chapter 1, after this, the first thing David does, he inquires of the Lord, shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. David said, to which shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. So David went up there, and his 2 wives also, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David brought up his men who were with him, that's the 600 men plus their families, and everyone with his household, and they lived in the towns of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. So Saul is now dead. David's time has come. Everybody in Israel by this time knows that David has been anointed as the next king, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's ready for it. He's got 600 men and their families. They've been living in Ziklag. Go ahead and bring the map up. Okay, so on the left is the Mediterranean Sea. Philistia, the major towns of the Philistines are there. Ziklag is on the lower left. And then if you go just a little bit up is Hebron. That is the major city in the tribe of Judah, which is the southernmost tribe in Israel. Now, we know that David was from the tribe of Judah. And so he's one of them. We also learned back in 1 Samuel 27 that when David had finally got tired of running from Saul and he ran to be covered by King Achish of Philistia, who gave him Ziklag to live in, that for 16 months he lived there, and he and his men would raid the nomadic tribes south of Judah and plunder them. And of course, he'd bring some of the plunder to Achish, but he would tell Achish that he had actually raided towns in Judah. He was trying to, that was the, how he was pulling the wool over Achish's eyes. But all this 16 months, he was bringing plunder to the elders in all the cities in Judah. And so, again, he's one of them, and so they are pro-David after all this happened. So he knows that they are sympathetic to him being the king. So the first thing he asked is, what should I do? Is it time yet? And God said, yes. He said, where should I go? He said, go to Hebron, which is the major city of Judah, so that's what he does. Hebron is 19 miles southwest of Jerusalem. And in Hebron is a very important town in Judah. There are buried Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac and his wife Rebekah are buried there. And Jacob and Leah are buried there. So they're all in a family tomb. And we'll talk about family tombs here in a little bit. So the men of Judah anoint David as king over the tribe of Judah. So that's how David's reign starts, simply as the king over the tribe of Judah. He's going to be the king of Judah for about 7 years. Ralph Davis in his commentary says, for the first time, Yahweh's chosen king visibly rules on earth over only one tribe. It's a small beginning, but it is the kingdom of God. For the moment, the kingdom of God is tucked away in the hills of Judah, but make no mistake, the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. So it starts small, but it's going to grow. Okay, verses 4b through 7. When they told David it is the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul, David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, May you be blessed by the Lord because you showed this loyalty to Saul your Lord and buried him. Now may the Lord show steadfast love and faithfulness to you, and I will do good to you because you've done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strong and be valiant, for Saul your Lord is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. Wow. So someone lets David know about the kindness that the men of Jabesh Gilead had shown the bodies of Saul and his son. Again, at the end of 1 Samuel, we learned that when Saul and his son had died, and the next day, the man of Jabesh Gilead, bring up the map there. Jabesh Gilead is on the right side of the Jordan River, and over at Beth Shin, that's a town in northern Israel that the Philistines, that's the area where that big battle was, and they had conquered that town, and they took the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons that died, including Jonathan, and nailed them to the outside walls of the city. And so at nighttime, the men of Jabesh Gilead traveled the 10 or 12 miles or so to Beth Shin when they heard about that, so they went under cover of darkness because that was a Philistine-occupied city. They took the bodies down. They were decomposing, and so they took them home. And so they could not give them the traditional Jewish burial because they were decomposing, so they had to burn the bodies, then they buried the bones. And so someone comes to David here and tells him about the kindness that these men of Jabesh Gilead had done to Saul and his sons. The reason they had such loyalty to Saul is because about 35 years earlier, one of the first battles that King Saul had fought was Ammonites who lived east of Jabesh Gilead had attacked Jabesh Gilead, and Saul had taken an army and defeated the Ammonites. So the men of Jabesh Gilead always remembered the kindness of Saul in protecting them and saving them from the Ammonites that invaded them. So David is aware they are very pro-Saul. So now Saul is dead, and David learns about their kindness to the bodies of Saul and his sons, and so he sends him a message. In this message, he tells them several things. This is tremendous diplomacy. He tells them he's not against them just because they are pro-Saul. He thanks them for their kindness to Saul and his sons. He asks the Lord's blessings on them. He promises to do good to them, so they shouldn't be afraid of him. But he mentions, by the way, Saul is dead, and Judah has made me king. So he's implying, why don't you be courageous and acknowledge me as your king also? So he's given them an opportunity. Now, we don't know, the Bible doesn't have any answer to that, and we know that he's not king over anything but Judah for 7 years. But still, one writer is so impressed that I read here David is about 30 years old, but the wisdom he shows as a leader, I think I put this on your lesson sheet, it says he is sincerely complimentary, blatantly political, and earnestly evangelistic all at the same time. So that was a great example of David's wisdom as a young man. Okay, verse 8 through 11. But Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and he made him king over Gilead and the Asherites and Jezreel and Ephraim and Benjamin and all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. But the house of Judah followed David, and the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Okay, let's bring up another map. It's funny, at supper tonight, my wife asked me, are we going to have any maps tonight? I said, honey, we're going to have a lot of maps. Back before GPS, we used to carry all these maps in the car, and she would drive and I would navigate, so she called me Map Man. So now that we don't have maps in the car, we have maps in Bible class. Anyway, okay, so All right, so the arrow shows you Mahanaim. That's where Abner, so the Philistines are on the other side of the Jordan in northern Israel. So Abner, the general of Saul's army, has escaped, I'm sure, with some of the army across the Jordan River. And so as you can see there, that's just below Jabesh Gilead that we just talked about. Anyway, so that's where they are. And so apparently Saul had 4 sons, and 3 were in battle, but he left Ishbosheth, probably knowing, because as you remember, Saul had gone to the witch of Endor. This is before the battle, because he wanted to know the outcome of the battle, and God allowed the spirit of Samuel to tell Saul, you and 3 of your sons, well, he said, I think he said, you and your sons are going to die in battle tomorrow. So Saul had the prophecy of Samuel to know that he was not going to live another day. So what we have here is Abner, the general of Saul's army, makes Ishbosheth, he crowns him king and says, you're the king of Israel. Now, we know that the Philistines occupied about half of northern Israel. We know that David was king of Judah. So just because he says that doesn't mean it's so, but apparently he kind of put him up as a puppet king for a couple of years. Now, I want you to notice something. It says Ishbosheth was 40 years old. We know that Jonathan was the oldest son of Saul. Remember, he was the great friend of David. Now, I remember back in Bible class years ago when I was a kid, it showed them as 2 kids that were friends. But Ishbosheth is not the oldest son of Saul, as he's 40 right now, so that means Jonathan was older than that when he died in battle. We know David's about 30, so obviously David and Jonathan had probably 12, 14 years age difference between them. The other point is here that I believe, and it doesn't really say this, but I believe that when the spirit of Samuel told Saul that he and his sons were going to die in battle, Saul, the reason he was chasing David for years was he didn't want David to be king. He wanted one of his sons to be king. And so I believe that's why he left Ishbosheth behind. He was probably the worst of the fighters, I guess you'd say, but left one son behind so that Abner could anoint him as king, because he wanted his lineage to continue as king, even though God had told him it wasn't going to happen. And so it's interesting. This situation was sort of the example in World War II for what's called the Sullivan Act, or the sole survivor policy of the United States military. Bring out the picture of the 5 Sullivan brothers. In World War II, there were 5 Sullivan brothers who were all on the same ship called the U.S. Juno, and it was sunk in 1942. So one family lost all 5 of their sons in one accident in the wartime. And so what happened after this, there was such an outcry that the military made a policy. It's called the sole survivor policy, and it stands today that if there's a family that has lost members in battle, the last sole surviving sibling has the option to not serve in hazardous duty situations. And that's called the Sullivan Act, or the sole survivor policy. Anyway, but that kind of comes from this situation here where Saul made sure one of his sons survived. Anyway, so, okay, let's go to verse 12 and 13. So Abner, son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. And Joab, the son of Zerah, and the servants of David went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. They sat down, one on one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. Okay, let's have another map. So it appears that Abner is the aggressor here, and he's probably challenged Abner and David's forces and the forces of Judah to a battle, and tells them to meet at Gibeon. So Gibeon, okay, let's see here. You look at the red arrow, goes from Mahanaim, looks like a little snake, and goes down, and then where the green arrow in the south, that would be Abner's men coming up. So Gibeon's right there in the middle. That's where they're meeting. And it says they meet at the pool of Gibeon. Okay, bring that picture up. Okay, so we believe that Abner is challenging Joab for them to have a battle and see, because Abner wants Ishbosheth to be the king over all Israel. Joab, of course, wants to defend David's right to be the king over Judah. So they meet at the pool of Gibeon. Okay, if you've got a cultural study Bible like we've recommended in the past, this is what the cultural study Bible says about this pool. The pool of Gibeon was excavated in the 1950s. One more proof that the Bible is exactly what it says it is. It is 39 feet across, it's 35 feet deep, and it's chiseled into limestone rock. It's at the bottom of the 35 feet deep, there's a 5-foot stairway that goes down through another tunnel down to the water table. And so this is a place where they could get water. This is where the people that lived in that area, Gibeon was a major city of that area, so they would come there. In rainy season, it would fill up, the water table would raise, and they could just dip their buckets in. There's a stairway that goes from the very top down to the bottom, and then it continues down this little hole. And I think I put that, on your lesson sheet, there's a YouTube video. It's about a 5-minute long. We don't have time to look at it tonight, but we call that your bonus homework if you'd like to really look at the pool of Gibeon some more. But the people that made that video said this is one of the first examples of hydraulic engineering. But this is where they were meeting. So one army is on one side of that pool, one army is on the other. Okay, verse 14 through 17. Abner said to Joab, "Let the young men arise and compete before us." And Joab said, "Let them rise." Then they arose and passed over by number, 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, the son of Saul. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, and that's where Gibeon is. And 12 were the servants of David. And each caught his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side, so they fell together. Therefore that place was called Helka Hazarim, which is at Gibeon. And the battle was very fierce that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. Okay, so what's happening here? This is what's called representative warfare. Remember we talked about this back in 1 Samuel 17 when David was fighting Goliath. So what was happening was the Philistines put Goliath up and said, okay, send your best fighter out and fight me. And the idea is whoever wins, that army wins, the other army loses, and they're now captives of the winning army. And so Abner doesn't want to take a chance on losing a big battle and losing all of his army, so he proposes a representative battle of 12 of his best fighters versus 12 of David's best fighters. So they gather around. So this is an artist rendition of that, where you got the two armies standing by while these 12 men on each side are fighting each other in hand-to-hand combat. So imagine it's a pretty gruesome scene, and it says even in the Bible there they were thrusting their swords into each other, grabbing each other's hair and thrusting their swords into each other. Okay, so it says that Abner and the men of Israel were beaten. So what we assume is that even though some of Joab's and David's men died, apparently some of them lived because all of Abner's men died. So that meant that Abner's army, the army of Israel, lost the battle. Now they're supposed to give up. It's kind of like when David beat Goliath. The Philistine army is supposed to lay down their arms and say, okay, you won the representative battle. No, they ran back then, and this time they run again. So Abner and his men run off rather than concede the battle. Okay, verse 18 to 21. They're on the back of your lesson sheet. And the three sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab, Abishai, and Ashiel. Now, Joab is the general of David's army. Now, Asahel was let's stop for a minute. Let me tell you who these people are. So, Zeruiah is David's sister, and she is older than all the boys. So she's quite a bit older. There were 8 sons of Jesse. 1 Samuel 16 tells us David was the youngest, but Zeruiah was the oldest. And scholars really think that she was actually married previously, but that husband died, and then she married Jesse. I'm sorry, back up. Zeruiah, David's mother, was married previously, and had Zeruiah, and so Zeruiah was actually a half sister to all the boys of Jesse. Okay, but that explains how her 3 sons were Zeruiah's 3 sons were about David's age, because there's a lot of kids between there. So maybe some of y'all are from families that have kids over a long period of time, and so some of your uncles and aunts are about your own same age. And so that's kind of what happened here. So Joab and his 2 brothers are nephews of David, but they're close to his age. So Joab is his general. Okay, Joab's 2 brothers are Abishai and Asahel. Okay, are you totally confused? Okay, it took me a while to figure that out too. Okay, so now Asahel, one of the brothers, was as swift of foot as a wild gazelle. And Asahel pursued Abner, and as he went, he turned neither to the right hand nor to the left from following Abner. Then Abner looked behind him and said, "Is that you, Asahel?" And he answered, "It is I." Abner said to him, "Turn aside to your right or to your left, seize one of the young men and take his spoil." But Asahel would not turn aside from following. So what's happening here is one of Joab's brother is chasing Abner, the general of the Israeli army, because we feel like that whole army is running away. And Ashael's very fast, so he's right behind Abner. Now, Abner's a great warrior. I mean, to be the leader of the army, you had to be the tough guy. So Abner, even though Ashael's fast, Abner knows he's a better warrior, so he's telling him, "I don't want to kill you because that would really make your brothers mad. So why don't you just go back there and take some plunder from one of my 12 men that just got killed and be happy with that." And Asahel refused to do that. So he's got fair warning. Okay, verse 22 and 23. And Abner said again to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I lift up my face to your brother Joab?" But he refused to turn aside. Therefore Abner struck him in the stomach with the butt of his spear, so that the spear came out his back. Nothing like a little blood and guts in Sunday school, huh? And he fell there and died where he was. And all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still. So all the army that was chasing his army that stopped when they saw that he had died. Now, again, the Cultural Study Bible tells us, you can bring up the picture of the casings, that back then spears had a head on them, which was the point, but generally on the other end they had a metal casing that was sharp so you could stick it in the ground. Back in 1 Samuel 26, when Saul and his army were sleeping and David came upon Saul and he could have killed him, it says his spear was stuck in the ground. So these are actual archaeological, one's a spearhead, and then the one on the right is a casing from the spear butt. So that's how Abner was able to just get his spear and just shove it back through Ashael's stomach. Okay, verse 24 and 25. But Joab and Abishai pursued Abner, and as the sun was going down, they came to the hill of Ammah, which lies before Giah on the way to the wilderness of Gibeon. And the people of Benjamin gathered themselves together behind Abner and became one group and took their stand on top of a hill. So Ashiel's two brothers, Joab and Abishai, gather the army and keep following Abner and his army. But Abner and his army get up on top of a hill, and the Benjamites are part of that army, kind of form a shield, and they're on top of a hill, so they kind of have the high ground. And so they take their stand to say, okay, if you're going to fight us, you're going to fight us here. Okay, verse 26 to 28. Then Abner called to Joab, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that the end will be bitter? How long will it be before you tell your people to turn from the pursuit of their brothers?" And Joab said, "As God lives, if you had not spoken, surely the men would have not given up the pursuit of their brothers until the morning." So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the men stopped and pursued Israel no more, nor did they fight anymore. So Abner's calling for a truce because he has a feeling that he's not going to win this war. So Joab agrees, and he blows the trumpet, and Joab agrees that his men want to continue the fight. So we learn next in verse 29 that Abner and his men take off. Even though it's nighttime, they take off. Abner and his men went all that night through the Arabah. They crossed the Jordan, so they go back to the east, back to Mahanaim. And I think it's because they were, rather than wait till the next day, I think they were afraid that Joab and his men might do a nighttime raid and change their minds. Okay, verse 30 to 31. So Joab returned from the pursuit of Abner, and when he'd gathered all the people together, there were missing from David's servants, David's army, 19 men besides Ashiel. But the servants of David had struck down of Benjamin 360 of Abner's men. So you can see why Joab wasn't really excited about fighting. He had lost 360 men, and David's army had lost 20, counting Ashiel. And you say, well, how is that possible? Such a disparity. When you think about it, back then, they didn't have a lot of boot camps and army training. Basically, if they brought up an army, they would call all the farmers and everything and say, bring what you have to fight with, and let's go fight the Philistines. And that's kind of what Abner's army was. But we remember from 1 Samuel, from the cave of Adullam, David, when he was hiding in the caves of Adullam, 400 men came to him, and we already knew that David was an expert fighter. And he spent months training 400 men to be incredible fighters. And all throughout his reign as king, they were called David's men of valor, because it was like special forces. They were, these guys were like the Army Rangers or the Navy SEALs. And so I promise you, that's who was in front of Joab's army. So if you have a bunch of, what if us men in this thing, they handed us all a weapon and said, let's go to war, and we're going to war against Army Rangers. How many of us can be dead, and how many of them would be dead? That's kind of what it was like. And so David had a tremendous force of highly trained men, where Abner most likely did not, and that's why the disparity in the losses of that battle. Okay, verse 32. And they took up Ashiel and buried him in the tomb of his father, which was at Bethlehem. And Joab and his men marched all night, and the day broke upon them at Hebron. Earlier we mentioned how Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Leah were all buried at Hebron. Back then in Israel, and they had family tombs. And so they buried Ashiel here in his family tomb at Bethlehem. And what they would do, as soon as someone died, they would wash and ritually purify. This was the ancient Jewish burial, and this is what they did with Jesus. They would wash the body, they would ritually purify it, they would wrap it in white linen cloths, that what we would call grave clothes. If it was a man, they would cover the head also. And then they would put it in the family tomb within 24 hours, because decomposition in a warm climate happens rapidly. And so they would put it in the family tomb, and in the family tomb there were usually multiple chambers, and there were benches, or rock benches, and they would put that person who had passed away and his grave clothes on that bench, and then they would close up the tomb. And so over the next year or so, that body would decompose. And so and there were multiple chambers, but it's a big extended family, so more people could die. So after a year or so, they would collect the bones from the person who had died the year before and put them in a stone box called an ossuary, which means a bone chamber. You may have, if you see many archaeological videos, you've seen pictures of ossuaries they've recovered from the time of Jesus. And so that's what happened with Ashiel. That's what happened with Abraham and Sarah and Rebekah and Jacob and Isaac, and that's just how they did things. Now, if someone's body was decomposed, like Saul and his 3 sons, they couldn't do that proper burial, and those were burned. And we'll learn later in 2 Samuel that, again, in a way of respecting Saul, King David recovers the bones from Jabesh Gilead of Saul and his 3 sons and has them put in the family tomb. So that's one more way that he respected Saul. Anyway, civil war is averted.